is not one dramatic event, but many that are radically reshaping the political landscape of the Middle East. And in ways, excuse me, and in ways that none of us had previously thought possible. There is simply no way to overstate the significance of what is taking place across the region today, from the transitions underway in Tunisia and Egypt following the historic removal of two long-time authoritarian rulers, to the ongoing and violent rebellions, or at least violent in terms of the response, in Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and other countries. No country in the region, in fact, is immune or has been left untouched by the events of the so-called Arab Spring. Whether or not they have faced active rebellions, no country has been untouched. And yet the administration is largely going about the quote-unquote peace process, much as it did for the past decade or so. In fact, both the nature of the conflict and the regional landscape had changed dramatically even before President Mubarak or President Ben Ali were dislodged from power earlier this year. We already had, for example, an internal split between political and geographic division between Hamas in Gaza and the Fatah-dominated West Bank government of the Palestinian Authority. We had a dramatic rightward shift in Israeli politics. We saw the proliferation and increased sophistication of weapons used by non-state actors like Hamas and Hezbollah, which of course have also affected the process. The dramatic rise of Iran and its influence in the region has been another outcome, another major development that has affected this process. And yet, the United States and its international quartet partners continue to pursue negotiations as though Hamas and Gaza were somehow outside of the context of the so-called peace process, or as though Syria and its role with regard to supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, its relationship with Iran, somehow could be divorced from this thing called the peace process. I think the events of the Arab Spring have only deepened the sense that the U.S. is behind the curve. For all its talk of new beginnings 2 years ago, the Obama administration remains wedded to the largely outdated, failed, and ineffective policy formulas and mechanisms developed nearly a decade ago, and of course in a completely different environment. To draw a somewhat crude analogy from technology, it is something like trying to run your iPad apps on your old PC using Windows 95. And it's a very difficult thing to do, I can assure you. Bold promises, lack of follow-through, and pendulum-like shifts in policy have all contributed to this perception, even before the Arab Spring, that the administration's Middle East peace efforts were politically adrift. One example, the settlement freeze debacle that we all sort of watched this drama over the last year or two. In the course of just 8 months, the administration's position went from demanding a full and comprehensive settlement freeze in all of the occupied territories to a partial moratorium, eventually that was agreed to for 9 months, to where we are today, which is no freeze at all. All of that in the course of a span of 8 months. The low point, I think, for the administration, and I think one of the decisive moments as far as Palestinians were concerned in their decision-making, came last December when the U.S. was forced to abandon attempts to induce Israel to extend the partial settlement moratorium with a multi-billion-dollar incentives package. The ill-advised offer would have provided Israel with 20 F-35 fighter jets and unprecedented diplomatic and security guarantees in exchange for a 90-day extension of a partial, temporary, and ultimately ineffectual moratorium on settlement construction in the West Bank. The problem was not in Israel's rejection of the offer, but that it was ever made in the first place. That the administration was prepared to trade unprecedented and far-reaching strategic assets for short-term and highly questionable tactical benefits betrayed a degree of desperation on its part. more fundamentally, it highlighted the absence of a strategic vision guiding U.S. policy. In the absence of American leadership, as we've heard from our two previous speakers, the parties have resorted to their own quote-unquote unilateral solutions. Israel through its ever-expanding settlement enterprise and other facts on the ground, and Palestinians by soliciting international recognition of a largely imaginary state. 2.5 years into the administration, and with the region in total turmoil, the only new initiative the administration has put forth is to state officially that the border between Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 line with agreed swaps, which of course is the oldest new idea in the world. But let's look at it in a different way. In 1988, we're talking about now 23 years ago, the PLO recognized Israel on the 1967 borders and accepted the idea of a Palestinian state in 12% of what it considered its historic homeland, what the PLO generally refers to as the historic compromise. Both Israel and the United States at that time were still opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state. It was not until more than a decade later, in 2001, that President Bush made the creation of a Palestinian state an official part of U.S. policy. It then took another decade, in 2011, this year, for the U.S. to state publicly what everyone already knew, that 1967 would be the basis for negotiations. At such a glacial pace of progress, I think we can expect a Palestinian state somewhere in the next 30 to 40 years. And of course I'm being sarcastic, but that's just to highlight the snail's pace. Ambassador Wilcox talked about incrementalism, and I think what part of the problem is that we've been engaged in hyper-incrementalism. If you look at the nature, pace of the progress that has been made thus far. The reality, of course, is that there has been no peace process for the past 2.5 years. Only occasional, directionless, and, in my view, misguided attempts at launching one. Senator Mitchell's resignation just a few weeks ago is above all, I think, an affirmation of this fact. One of the fundamental contradictions, I think, in this administration's approach is that on the one hand, it has identified resolving the conflict as a vital national security interest. But I think one of the biggest problems is that you can't say that resolving this conflict is a vital national security interest and then somehow set it aside for whatever reason, domestic political reasons, bilateral relationship with Israel, and so forth. It's either a national security interest that is vital to the United States, or it's not. There are, I think, three fundamental paradoxes that need to be resolved before any credible process can emerge. Each of the three, of course, relating to the main actors in this process, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. For the United States, the paradox is that the U.S. is both the only party that can act and deliver a lasting agreement, and the only party that thus far hasn't been willing to act. For Israel, there's another paradox. Israelis feel no urgency to resolve the conflict when things are quiet, as they are now, had a period of relative calm. And at the same time, there's no will to resolve the conflict or take the risks in order to resolve the conflict when things are not quiet, as we saw 10 years ago in the midst of the Intifada. At that time, the refrain was, Israel won't negotiate under fire. And for the Palestinians, we have another paradox. As the party of negotiations, the PLO / the Fatah leadership of the PLO, only a Fatah-dominated Palestinian leadership can deliver a deal with Israel. At the same time, their willingness to engage in seemingly perpetual, and I would say self-perpetuating, negotiations with little to show for them has severely eroded their moral and political legitimacy in the eyes of many Palestinians. So Palestinians are confronted with this Hobson's choice of either you engage in a process that ultimately kills your political standing vis-a-vis your people, and as we've seen, led eventually to a split within the Palestinian Authority, or you satisfy your international backers, and or you engage in a process where you attempt to meet the needs of your people, and of course then annoy your international donors and political supporters, namely the United States and the European Union, not to mention Israel. In my view, the time has come for a paradigm shift in how the U.S. goes about resolving this conflict, one that is capable of unlocking these three basic paradoxes, and above all, one that is commensurate with and reflective of the dramatic changes taking place in the region. And I think this will require primarily expanding the existing circle of involvement in this process beyond the United States to not just the other quartet members, but to include regional actors, and in particular, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, possibly Turkey, Qatar, and others. And I think related to this, beginning to take into account this new relevance of Arab public opinion, including Palestinian public opinion, in how this peace process has been pursued. I think for a long time, the process has been held up either because of American politics or Israeli politics, and Palestinians have been denied essentially politics throughout that period. And I think the Arab world also, being under largely authoritarian rulers, have been denied a measure of political participation. And I think now, in this new environment, this is the new variable that's been introduced is Arab public opinion, and it will matter, and it will shape the policies of those governments, and eventually our own. Only then, I think, will the parties calculate that they have more to gain by engaging with an American-led process than by acting outside of it. While merely articulating a strategic vision does not in itself guarantee the administration's efforts will succeed, I'm almost certain that the absence of one all but assures that they cannot. Thank you.